Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. This video is a little bit later, but it's okay. I'm still here, and you are as well. We are continuing on to Unit 4. Yes, Unit 4. We opened it yesterday with a look at ultranationalism. So we talked about what it was. We introduced some of the ideas associated with ultranationalism, what it is, the crimes against humanity, genocide. These are all effects of ultranationalism. We looked at three specific examples. We looked at Germany, Japan, and Italy. These three kind of epitomize ultranationalism in the 1920s and going into the 1930s. We are missing one more key country that will round off our examination of the ultranationalists, and that is the Soviet Union. That's what we're going to focus our attention on today. So if you're following along in the booklet, this is page 6, or if you're in the slide, this is slide 15. We are going to look at the question of what was ultranationalism in the USSR. So the USSR stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. You can just call it the Soviet Union if you want, or if you really want to call it the USSR, go for it. It's up to you, totally. That's what we're going to do today. Just before we start, I should have probably mentioned this at the beginning. Continue doing the work for Unit 3. A lot of you are starting to send in your projects, which is fantastic, and I've been marking them. Please make sure you do that, your written response, and the booklets as well. And again, a lot of you have been doing that, so it's fantastic. So keep up that good work. But back to the present information. So the terms that are going to be introduced, we're going to be introduced to Joseph Stalin and the work that he is going to do in the Soviet Union, and also the Holodomor, which, if you're not aware of, is a genocide. So we're going to talk about that today, unfortunately. Let's begin. We're going to have to jump back a little bit, though. We're going to have to jump back to World War I and the creation of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union kind of comes into and it replaces the Russian Empire. So Russia was the first major country to crash out or to crack under the pressure of World War I. So Russia, being the largest of the nations, was unfortunately the least industrialized. So it wasn't able to maintain the levels necessary for them to keep fighting the war. Things that they were lacking were weapons, ammunition, food, clothing, equipment, essentially basic stuff that you need to supply your armies with and to have them fight effectively. So it's hard to say. There are examples of it, in these battles on the Eastern Front that Russian soldiers were going with no ammunition, some with no weapons, some with holes in their shoes, some of them with no proper clothing for the weather. It was really just difficult for them. So in terms of their casualties, it's hard to determine from the early set in the war up until when they leave. But by 1917, around 2 million Russian soldiers have died in the war, and 1.5 million civilians have also died, more due to famine and disease, because the Russian state isn't able to supply the army. Imagine the people. And in times of war, the army takes priority over the people, so there's a lot of starvation and a lot of anger towards the state. By 1917, 2.5 million Russian soldiers were being held captive in Germany and in Austria-Hungary. So not only are they ill-equipped, but they're also losing a lot of battles, obviously. If you are not equipped to fight, how are you expected to win? So there's a lot of prisoners. So when you're talking about famine and disease at home, hearing that at the front your armies are losing, you start to get people upset. So when we talked yesterday about political crises and social crises, these are starting to boil, because politically the people are upset that their leader, the Tsar, has lost control, and he can't seem to do anything right, and also socially, it's not a good thing for morale when all you hear about is your army being defeated over and over. Oh, and you're hungry at the same time too. So this is the stage that is set for February 1917, where there is a revolution in Russia. And the revolution is basically calling for the Tsar, Nicholas II, to step down because he is just a failure, essentially, to put it bluntly. So he abdicates. So he essentially steps down from the throne because everyone is upset. He has taken personal control of the army. He doesn't have a general underneath him that he is allowing to run things the way that in Germany they did. So he is taking full responsibility for the failures of the army. So therefore, he is forced. He abdicates. He steps down. So a provisional government was established, but it maintained committing to. It was still willing to go along with the war to help fight Germany, because they were afraid of what would happen if they asked for a surrender. So we now have a shift in government. We have a provisional government that is organized by the Social Democrats. So they are more liberal in their thinking, but they're still unsure of what to do during the war. Fast forward a few months to October, and we have another revolution. This is known as the October Revolution in 1917. Now, the majority group within this Social Democrat party is called the Bolsheviks. So the Bolsheviks, it means majority in Russian. They overthrew and they violently rose up against the rest of the parties that were running this government, known as the Mensheviks, and they overthrow them. They overthrow the government and establish a government based on the principles of communism. So I'll put a video about the history of communism as well in the description, just to help you understand if you don't know. So they overthrow the government, and they are now the new government. There's a lot more that goes on in there, so it's not as simple as I'm explaining it to you. If you're really interested, I can give you some more information on that, just to help you along. They are more willing to end the war. They agree to sign a treaty known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany and Austria-Hungary. And they agree to the terms, which are really harsh, and Russia loses a huge chunk of land, a lot of its the land that was used to grow food and crops, and also a lot of people. So if you're following along, slide 19, that shaded in red color area, that all goes to Germany and to Austria-Hungary, and Russia essentially is lost a bulk of what is now the Ukraine, which, for those of you that are not aware of your European geography, the Ukraine is very fertile land for growing grain. So for a large country as big as Russia, that's huge, because they are concerned about famines. However, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, they argue, he says, I will bring you peace, land, and bread. He has three things that he's telling the Russian people, that these are the things that you're going to get if you follow me and my people. And they are willing to listen because, like I said, you have these crises politically, economically, and socially. And this man is answering all those three things. So in times of desperation, a man promising you solutions is a person that you're going to listen to. Kind of like what we saw with Germany and Japan and Italy. So this is the start. But in Russia, the Bolsheviks are not necessarily agreed on as to be the successors of the Tsar. So there's opposition to the Bolshevik government, and it was growing and growing, so that starting in 1917 all the way up until 1922, we have a civil war. So the Bolsheviks create for themselves what's known as the Red Army, and they fight against the opposition. So it's Mensheviks, it's the Tsarists, so the people who wanted the monarchy to come back, and they formally become known as the White Army. So it's made up of a bunch of different people. So it's not an organized and they're not all necessarily friends. They all just see the Bolsheviks as the ultimate enemy. So they will, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So they'll all work together to fight against the Bolsheviks. So ultimately, the Reds were able to defeat the Whites, to put it simply, which also included some outside power. So the British, the French, the Americans, the Japanese, they all wanted the Whites army to win and to get rid of the Bolsheviks, because they were afraid of what these Bolsheviks were advocating for. So a lot of them, a lot of foreigners, they really got involved to try to prevent the Bolshevik takeover. But they are unable to, especially it has a lot to do with the fact that after 1919, and we're going into 3 more years of civil war, a lot of the Europeans are like, we don't want to fight anymore. We've seen a lot of devastation, so a lot of them don't really give it their all in terms of supporting the White Army. Not to mention the fact that the White Army, made up of different groups, remember, they don't necessarily agree with each other as well, because the Mensheviks and the liberals and the socialists don't really agree with the monarchists because they don't like the monarchy. They fought to overthrow it as well. So it's over. The Whites are defeated. The Red Army is victorious. The Bolsheviks are now in charge, and they declare the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, or the CCCP in Russian. And it's established in 1922. So if you're looking at this map on slide 20, that is what it looks like. It is huge. It encompasses all of modern day Russia, all of Central Asia, so Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, etc. The Caucasus eventually will be a part of it, so Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. And then it also takes in Europe, it takes the Ukraine and Belarus. We will see what happens with the rest as well. We'll be including other countries in the future, places like Mongolia, places like Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, and then so on. But this is all we have right now. So around 10 million civilians they die in the Civil War. So from 1914 to about 1922, we've seen millions of Russians die, based on being in the First World War and then the Civil War that happens afterwards. However, this is it. The Soviet Union has been established. So slide 21, there's a video here of the Russian Revolution. I'd give it a watch. It'll gloss over things more. But again, if you want more in-depth information, I can definitely provide it to you. The Russian Revolution was one of my focuses for my first degree, so I feel like I can help you out a lot more. Anyways, so let's fast forward a little bit. We're going to see the rise of an individual. You may know him, Joseph Stalin. He rises up out of the Civil War. So prior to the Civil War, he had been a part of the Bolsheviks. He was an organizer within the party. He will become essentially the first leader of the Soviet Union. Yes, Vladimir Lenin is technically in charge up until 1924 when he dies, but after 1924, Stalin will really take charge. There is a power struggle at the beginning because Lenin dies and he doesn't really appoint a successor. He has a suggestion that it should be a man by the name of Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky was the leader of the Red Army, close confidant of Vladimir Lenin, and he was kind of groomed to be the next successor. He had a different view on how the Soviet Union, what it should do. I won't go too much into it, but essentially what he wanted to do was, they had a revolution in Russia. He said, let's keep it going. Let's go to other countries and allow them to have a revolution too. Whereas Joseph Stalin had an idea of, no, we're going to stick in Russia and build up our strength here. So there's a power struggle, and eventually Joseph Stalin takes over. He will exile Leon Trotsky, basically calling him a traitor, and he'll force him to leave the Soviet Union, and he will go and live in Mexico. But for those of you that don't know, and I'll just tell you now, I'll probably maybe even tell you eventually later, but Leon Trotsky actually gets assassinated by an assassin sent to Mexico by Stalin. So it happens in 1940, so this is about almost 20 years later, so Stalin doesn't forget. And he will actually have Leon Trotsky killed. So Stalin has secured position in the Soviet Union. On slide 23, there is an introduction to who Stalin was. I'd give that a watch as well. Probably be very beneficial. Let's move on though. So Stalin is in control, and this is where we start to see the rise of this ultranationalism. Stalin begins an aggressive program of modernization and industrialization based on the principles of communism. So one of the biggest and most important components of communism is this idea of collectivization. It is used extensively in the Soviet Union at the start of in the mid 1920s. Nothing is owned privately by citizens. Everything is owned by the collective. So one of the first places that Stalin will collectivize is farms. He goes around the Soviet Union and takes a bunch of small little farms, brings them all together into this massive farm, and anyone that lived on those little farms, you now worked for the state. So you would, your job now was to be a state farmer instead of just a farmer for yourself, which had a very negative impact, and we'll see later what I mean. And also related to communism, this idea of a command economy. So it developed based on this idea of the 5-year plans, which Stalin puts into place, and will transform the Soviet Union. So Stalin, when he takes control, he looks at the Soviet Union and he sees how backwards it is. He saw during the First World War how they couldn't even supply their army with ammunition and guns to fight against the Germans and the Austrians. So he's thinking to himself, we need to get the Soviet Union up and modernized, because they were roughly about 100 years behind the rest of the world. So in his first 5-year plans, he focuses on industry, building up of industry, factories, these sort of things. It's very brutal, and we're going to see what happens. But in those 5 years, Stalin is able to drag Russia to a modern state like the rest of Europe. And when the rest of Europe and the world is going through the Great Depression, the Soviets are not, because they aren't a part of that web of capitalist economies. They don't depend on anybody. They are really going at it by themselves. If they need something from another country, they go and they pay for it. They don't have any trade agreements or anything, at least not yet. So these 5-year plans are what bring a huge uplift to Soviet industry. And what Stalin does is he goes to other countries and buys factory parts, and he buys machinery to bring it back. Now, he's also strapped for cash, so what is he going to pay for it with? He's going to pay for it through grain, because he's taken back the Ukraine, which is a huge breadbasket for Europe, and he's going to use the grain there to kind of pay for things. Because remember, other countries are going through this crisis, so if they can give some machinery and barter it for grain, they're going to do that. And this is where we're going to see this famine. So the famine in Ukraine, it's going to go from 1932 to 1933. A little backstory about Ukraine. It had always been under the rule of the Russians as far back as the first Romanov. So the first, the start of the Russian Empire. So all the way back to Peter the First, back in the 1700s. So it had always been a part of it. So Ukrainian nationalism was on the rise following the Russian Revolution. The Ukrainians tried unsuccessfully to become an independent state. So they saw trouble in Russia, and they were like, we're going to use this and try to get from underneath their foot. Unsuccessfully, though. So much of the Ukraine ideal was for growing wheat. So this idea of the Kulaks are land-owning farmers. They're wealthy farmers, and these are going to be the ones that get targeted very quickly. So they were very strongly supporting independence because they saw it as their benefit. They were rich, and they wanted to not be collectivized. Because remember we talked about collectivization. One of the first places they do it is in farming, and they don't want to be a part of these collective farms because they've made a very successful life not. So Joseph Stalin organized the Soviet farms into collectives, taking farmland away from local owners and giving it to the community. So many kulaks resisted, burning their crops and livestock instead of turning them over. So they were like, essentially it's a big middle finger to Stalin, saying, I'm not going to give you my stuff. I'd rather it be burned than give it to you. So you're going to see a retaliation by the Soviet leadership on these kulaks. And they're going to really be demonized into these hated figures in the Soviet Union. And we'll see through the use of propaganda and things like that. So Stalin took Ukrainian wheat and sold it internationally to generate capital to basically build up his economy. So he closed off the Ukraine, so nobody's going in and nobody's going out. Anyone caught hiding food was arrested in Ukraine. Any reports of what happened in the Ukraine were suppressed by the Soviets. So it was very much on the hush-hush. Nobody knew what was going on. So grain is being pulled out at an extremely high rate to pay for things. Nobody is aware of it, but people are starving to death. So anywhere from 3 to 7 million Ukrainians died because of this artificial famine. We call it artificial because it wasn't like the crops were failing. They were just being sucked out to pay for things. And nobody knew because this wasn't happening. So this is recognized as a Ukrainian genocide because it's being done on the Ukrainian people specifically. So Stalin and the Soviet Union, after his death, always denied the famine was caused by Soviet government policy. In 2006, the Ukrainian parliament declared the Holodomor was an attempt of genocide against the Ukrainian people. Obviously, it's not been accepted by the Russian government. So we now know that this many people, at least 7 million Ukrainians, died during the Holodomor. And the reason we know this is because of the survivor story. So in the description, I'm going to put a link to a website where you can listen to the survivor stories if you want to. And I'm also going to put a footage of the of what happened in Ukraine as well, also in the description. I warn you though, if you're not comfortable with seeing that sort of stuff, starvation, death, and all that stuff, I would not recommend watching it. But it happened. And here's the thing too that a lot of people seem to forget is that if we're talking 7 million Ukrainians died, that is it should be in the same category as the Holocaust. If we're looking at just the Holocaust in total kills 13 million people. 6 million of them were Jews, and that's what we focus on a lot. But we're talking 7 million Ukrainians, and not a whole lot of people are aware of what happened then. And this is quite severe. So if you're looking at the map on slide 27, the red bits, that is where more of the deaths happen. So you can see that there's a lot of red in the Ukraine because it was extensively there. So here's on slide 28. There's a 5-minute video for the Holodomor. I will put some in the description below. So that is it for this video. If we look at the question, the summary of what was ultranationalism in the USSR, we can talk about the rise of the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution, the overthrowing of the Tsar. We see the rise of Stalin and his plans, the 5-year plans, to build up the Soviet industry and essentially create a pride in Soviet industry and a pride that they can be a strong country going forward. We do see that there is a cost to this industrialization, and that comes through the famines in the Ukraine. Now, we can see ultranationalism as focusing its attention on Ukraine and the kulaks and not on, say, the Russians. So we can see this sort of ultranationalism propping up there as well. So yes, that's about it for today. Please continue working on the stuff from last unit. We're going to just keep rolling along with things this unit. So tomorrow there won't be a video. Friday will be a video. So that's it. Stay safe. Enjoy the weather. It looks like a nice day out today. And yeah, I will see you Friday.